Hey guys, thanks for joining us today. My name is Eric Vento. I'm here with Rachel Murdock, and this is another government to private podcast. Rachel joins us after over a decade in the FBI as a forensic interviewer, and now she is in her own private practice. Today, we are going to talk about the mental health effects of transitioning, both in general, any kind of transition, personal or professional, but also hone in on the actual transition that we are talking about from a government to private perspective. We're going to talk about some of the things that we need to be aware of, how it impacts us, whether our transition is voluntarily or involuntary, and then some of the things that we can do to help mitigate the effects of the transition on our personal and professional lives. Rachel, thank you so much for agreeing to join us on this podcast, and I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Eric. Like Eric mentioned, I'm Rachel Murdock. I am an owner of a group practice in the Kansas City, Missouri metropolitan area called Beyond the Storm Behavioral Health. And I am, I think, still in transition as I just left my FBI career in January of this year. And one mistake that I feel like I made was that I left my FBI job on Friday, January 13th, and I started my new job on Monday, January 16th. So that, in hindsight, was a little rushed for such a big move, but here we are 6 months in, and I've really been able to enjoy this new journey and adjust to the new normal. And my practice specializes in first responder mental health and survivors of trauma, and also anxiety and mood disorders like depression. So it has been a lot of changes, but they're all exciting. And I feel like it's a really great opportunity since I just went through it and, understand what it feels like to be in a position where you don't quite know what to do. My separation was voluntary, but it didn't make it easy. And so it was definitely something I spent a lot of time and took a lot of guidance from, other individuals that I trust to make the decision of when the timing was right.
Awesome. Well, really appreciate that introduction. That really hits home for me just because, as we discussed, my transition out of law enforcement was not voluntary. And, I've done multiple podcasts with Brian Tuskin and Carlos Francisco and Scott Walker, to name a few, talking about that transition and what it really did to me on a personal and professional level, not the least of which was, significant issues with anxiety and depression and mood disorders and stuff like that, just because, for me, I lost that sense of identity. I lost that sense of family. And it wasn't because of a choice that I made, voluntarily. It was ripped away from me. And so it took me a long time to recover from that. And, so I definitely have the opposite, side of the story, but I also recognize that it's different for everybody. And so, I would love to hear from you on, some of the research or some of the, at a high level, obviously, some of, what you've learned from, people you've interviewed in the past, patients that you've had on, what are some of the warning signs of a unhealthy transition, if you will. And I know this is a really subjective question, but I think it's important for people to recognize in general, this is what we should be looking out for as we either undergo the transition or as we start to evaluate what that would look like.
Sure. And it's a great question because you're absolutely right. It is very individualized what are warning signs for one person versus another. And so a lot of the feedback that I give to my patients is you have to know when something is different for you. So if you have family members or friends or coworkers that are articulating to you that something is different or that they're noticing something that seems off, really take that to heart, because I know that was something for me that really resonated because I was in the middle of the stuff and I couldn't necessarily see what others could see. And so when I had a couple of trusted colleagues be able to push me a little bit, when I was saying, I'm fine, everything's okay, I'm good, they were able to push a little bit and say, basically like, I don't believe you. Like, I think you're saying you're fine, but I'm really concerned. And so surrounding yourself with people that can, call you on the bullshit a little bit and really be willing to push whenever you are maybe in a place where you are struggling, whether it's during transition or just generally speaking, and you being willing to accept that feedback and take a second look and see, is there something else going on here? I didn't rush my transition in that I took a long time to decide that I ultimately, wanted to part ways with the FBI to go a different direction, but I did rush it once I started. And like I mentioned, I do think that was a mistake and it caused unnecessary stress. And, but, like I say, I went from making a salary and benefits to nothing because I am self-employed. And so I had some imposter syndrome going on and some scarcity mindset. And I was creating additional stress, anxiety, and other issues because I wouldn't give myself the space to grieve what life I thought was going to be. And so that's one thing I can really make a suggestion for people that have the space to do that, is to give yourself whatever amount of time you need to close that chapter and move on to the next one. Because I struggled for some time, and even still now, where I wonder, about the timing, or I think, could I have done something differently? And not because I'm not happy, but because any transition is tough, even the good ones. And so really just giving yourself that space and knowing yourself to know this is too much, even though it's exciting and good. And what can I do to implement some changes to start to improve any, symptoms that I'm having that are uncomfortable?
Just realized I was on mute and I was talking to myself. Awesome.
You were.
Um, I love what you said, just because, I think part of this problem that we have within, law enforcement and the military and the intelligence community specifically is that the mental health struggle is not humanized. And it's not normalized either. People think that they have to hide it, and in some respects they're right. You may face, unfortunately, retaliation or any number of other negative effects from being honest and transparent about the mental health struggle of working in the field that you're in. This is a very difficult field to be in, and it's very much expected that we're each going to cope and deal with what we see on a daily basis in our own way, but there's also, in my opinion, there's no expectation that all of us deal with it in a perfectly acceptable or perfect way. We all have our demons. We all have the things that we wish we could unsee, nightmares, and, a whole lot of other things that are an after effect, if you will, of what we have experienced, what we have seen, scenes that we have responded to, interviews that we've done, obviously child pornography and a lot of other issues that primarily only raise themselves in our industries.
Right.
And, I think it's important to call out that we're human, and that as much as we think, hey, it doesn't affect me, or, I'm good with it, I'm good with compartmentalizing, at least speaking for myself, eventually it does catch up to you. Yep. For me, I worked in ICAC for a number of years, and I could only work there for a brief period of time until I had to leave, but I really didn't think about it again until I became a father. Mm-hmm. And, that caused a whole new, inflection point, if you will, because it caused me to think about that, not in this compartmentalized mindset of, oh, that's someone else's kid, but no, this is my kid, and, I'm not, it definitely, like I said, it depends on how you think about it, but it also depends on, the circumstances in which you find yourself when you experience the trauma.
Right.
And, I'd love to hear just from your perspective, what are some of the things that someone can do to potentially deal with this trauma in a healthy way, and not allow it to really invade their lives, to such a significant extent where it's causing, a lot of waves, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the tricky part is a lot of us are trained to compartmentalize as part of our job. That's how you survive being in, law enforcement or exposure to cumulative trauma. But when you become too good at it and everything becomes compartmentalized, like you mentioned, at some point it's going to boil over. And so we, of course, impress upon the importance of taking care of your mental health. And that can look a variety of different ways. Of course, there is therapy. And I will give credit to the law enforcement community because I believe that there is a greater acceptance and recognition for the use of therapy with first responders, veterans, government employees, anyone that is, in a high stress exposure type job. And the nice thing is that therapists have caught up and they are becoming culturally competent if they want to work with the law enforcement community. And what that means is we are individuals that either have experience working in law enforcement as, sworn or civilian, or we have expertise or professional or personal experience that helps set us apart from therapists that don't have that. And so I mention all of that because maybe someone has been to a therapist before who wasn't culturally competent and they've made them cry, or they've had a situation where they've had to explain every nuance of their agency, that it became something that didn't feel like it was helpful. And so for those of you that have experienced that, I encourage you to give therapy another try with someone who gets it, because there really is some safety in talking with someone who is a trained mental health professional who also understands what it's like to do the work that you do. Because if you haven't, viewed CSAM as part of your work, or if you don't know what that looks like, it can be hard to explain to someone how it's ever comfortable. Everybody would say, like, well, of course it bothers you, but it shifts, like you just mentioned. Like when you became a father, there wasn't the detachment that was there before. And I absolutely get that, because when I became a mom, the same thing happened for me. The exposure changed. And there's nothing to say that you can't do this job with or without kids, but you have to know what's working for you. So giving yourself permission to do whatever you need to do to prioritize whatever's important to you. It doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you, not an asset to the field if it's time to do something different. Finding a mental health professional that, does connect with you, that can provide resources and coping skills, because, some of my clients and patients have come in and they are getting ready to retire and they feel at the absolute end of their rope. They have, been, they've lost marriages, they are in dire straits, and they don't want to live the rest of their lives like this. And so we want to intervene before it gets there and be able to provide some coping mechanisms and protective factors for resiliency to help get it out before the volcano erupts. And so there are a lot of us out there that have a lot of good information to share to help individuals that are exposed to cumulative trauma get the help that they need. It's just knowing where to look and not giving up on the process if it didn't go well the first time, because maybe you just didn't have that right fit.
I love that. And, the reason I love it, and that's just not like a canned response to what you're saying, is, all this is deeply personal to me. And when I transitioned to the private sector, I did a podcast with someone, and I went really deep. I went really personal about what I was going through. And that podcast was eventually deleted because I received feedback that no one wants to hear that, and you won't get a job by being that personal.
Yeah.
And I could not disagree more. Yes, bias does exist, prejudice exists. We all have unconscious biases. We all have our own things, especially in the private world. Like I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if you pour your heart out on social media that you won't experience some level of negativity. You
Right.
know, like everyone has an opinion, and as much as we try to say that our biases don't affect our decision making, they do, especially
Right.
when it comes to hiring. You know,
Yeah.
um, but what I will say is this: my story and my journey with mental health, from law enforcement to corporate, especially what I've gone through, multiple agencies, multiple terminations. Um, I don't see that as a weakness. I see that as very much a strength. It's very much a part of my story. Now, did I think that was a weakness, 8 years ago? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because my circumstances were different. And that's an important caveat to be able to say is your mindset changes as you grow.
Yes.
And, you know, now I see that as this is a strength. This is part of my story. This is part of my journey. And my struggle, and it is very much a daily struggle still, my struggle with mental health and with, my transition out of law enforcement has enabled me to have significantly more empathy for the
Absolutely.
people around me. Whereas before, not to say that I was an a-hole, but I didn't have as much, but as we go through life and as we go through different experiences, we start to realize that there are different perspectives beyond our own, and as we get exposed to those different areas like mental health, like, you know, going to therapy, taking medication to control anxiety, and any number of other coping mechanisms, or whatever you want to call them, we start to realize, like, well, I had a negative opinion of people like this in the past, but now I am that person.
Right.
And it's causing me to be able to function in a healthy way. It's causing me to be able to sleep better at night. It's causing me to be able not to snap at my wife and my kids on a consistent basis. It's, there's all these different, you know, um, effects, if you will, that you can call out from your intentionality when it comes to mental health. And I think that's just important to say is, you know, um, being able to recognize or have other people say, hey, I've really noticed a change in you and it's not for the better, and being able to take that with, a sufficient dose of humility,
Right.
and to say, you know what, you're right. And then be able to have a hard conversation with yourself and say, well, that's not because my fridge went out the other day. It's because
Right.
I'm struggling with not being in my family anymore, not having that identity, not carrying a badge and a gun, not having, a patch on my arm, not having my law enforcement ID, not having, insert whatever you want into that sentence. But there is a certain amount of loss that comes with transitioning, and it's important to grieve that
Hmm.
loss. And that's something that I never did until many, many years later.
Yeah.
And that was a very freeing experience for me. Um, it's kind of like, what you mentioned about, retiring from the FBI and starting that job, on the next business day. It's like you didn't really give yourself a chance to grieve that loss,
Right.
and yeah, I definitely empathize with a lot of what you said.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And one of the things that I was considering during the transition is a lot of what you just mentioned. Like when people ask me, what I do for a living, we don't always share when we work for the FBI. They teach us so much about need to know. So we do keep a pretty good, operational security and presence there. But to tell people that I trusted, that I work for the FBI, there's always this reaction of, oh my gosh, how did you do that? That's my dream job. And so there really does become part of an identity that is associated with some of those positions, because there is a lot of, clout with certain positions and certain things. And especially with my job as a forensic interviewer, I remember being a baby interviewer back, 17 years ago, and seeing a couple of interviewers at the FBI at a training, and I said, I want to be them someday. And so when that dream came true, I was, so thrilled and honored to have had that opportunity. And it was a very big piece of cognitive dissonance for me, because then I was walking away from the thing that I had pursued for so long. And what does that mean about me? And what would people think about me? And so it really is a journey to realize that what worked for you at age 22 may not work at 32 or 42, and that is okay. And your reasons are your reasons. And you and I have talked a little bit about the differences between voluntary separation and involuntary, and there is a complexity of considerations there. But in some ways, for me, it being voluntary was tricky, because I was intentionally walking away from something that I had the opportunity to stay at. So it was a lot of pressure about making the right decision. And so I learned in my journey that I had to look at, my priorities and where my goals were leading me, and just take that leap of faith. And now that I'm on the other side, I'm really proud of myself, because I'm a meticulous planner. I do not like the unknown. I don't like the what ifs. And that is a big leap of faith, to walk away from something that was really good, to hope that the next thing will be good, if not better. And so it really is a journey mentally when you are making any transition, whether it's on, your own terms or someone else's, is just rectifying that push and pull that you have when you are feeling like a fish out of water in this new situation. I mean, I had done the same job really for 16 years, because I had done it in the private sector at a state agency prior to that. So I had been a forensic interviewer since 2 months after graduating from graduate school. It had become every part of my being. And so to transition into something that I hadn't done in a while, and that is very different, was exciting, but also scary. And it's what made me kind of dig my, heels in, and not do it for so long, because I just didn't know how to function, not as an interviewer, and then not as an FBI person, because of so much that comes with it that I tied my identity to. But at the end of the day, I realized that, jobs come and go, but what my family and my mental health and my happiness are things that I'm going to carry with me wherever I work. And so I was able to make that separation when I needed to.
I love that. I appreciate you sharing that. One of the things that you and Jessica didn't get a chance to talk about was the increased risk of suicide, during the transition process. I think it's important to call that out, because, far too many of us don't deal with the transition in a healthy way, which leads to a loss of life. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We know that there is an increased risk of suicide in our society. And then when you couple that with law enforcement, first responders, veterans, and the risk increases exponentially. And that doesn't change, with the flip of a switch, because someone leaves law enforcement to go into the private sector. You carry that cumulative trauma with you. And so I wanted to mention that piece, because I don't want there to be that disconnect of, well, I'm no longer in law enforcement, or I'm no longer, someone that's working for the government, so these things shouldn't bother me still, because it's still a part of who we are. And the things that make us good at our jobs are difficult things in our personal lives. And so all of that said, anytime there's a high level of stress or a large amount of trauma that is experienced, it can increase risk for suicide. And it's not something that people necessarily want to talk about, because they fear that if they tell the wrong person, that there may be consequences to that they don't want to deal with. I've had patients come in and say, when I ask them if they've ever had, thoughts of hurting themselves or killing themselves, and they say, well, are you going to send me to the hospital if I say yes? And so I want to, break down that concern, that there are other steps that we take with people that are experiencing suicidal ideation and suicidality before the knee-jerk reaction of having someone hospitalized. That does happen sometimes if there is an acute safety concern, but there are a lot of people that experience what we call passive suicidality. And I think that resonates with more people because that is when we might feel like it would just be easier if I didn't wake up tomorrow, or I'm so overwhelmed that I wish I would just go to sleep and that would be that. And I think that feeling maybe resonates with more folks than I want to kill myself and I have a plan and here's what I will do, because not everybody gets to that point, and that's a goal. But I do think that a larger number of individuals have had those moments where they've thought about what it would feel like if they just ran their car off the road or ended that suffering. And so it is thankfully not as taboo of a topic as it used to be societally, but it is still something that we're missing in law enforcement and with veterans because it is happening at rates that are still way too high. So there are so many resources out there. Of course, 988, which is the National Suicide Hotline. Some people know that they won't call a number like that. So find a trusted clinician, mental health resource, whatever's in your community to keep you safe, because that's the most important piece. But we would be remiss when we're talking about mental health to not make mention of the fact that when there is a lot of stuff going on, even when it's good or even when it's wanted, it still can bring about high levels of anxiety and stress. And if you already have those, components going on with yourself, plus trauma, plus change, it can be very overwhelming. And some of those thoughts can creep up. So just again, just a recognition point for yourself, when you get overloaded, when you get overwhelmed, overstimulated, do you notice those symptoms increase and what can be done to keep you safe? Maybe that's just, putting away things that are dangerous. Like if you've got a bunch of firearms, maybe giving them to someone else, which might feel extreme, but it's something that may be necessary if you're starting to feel like you're not safe in your own home. And we know that veterans and law enforcement and even the public have access to things that can kill us. So we just want to be mindful of what the risks are in our own lives and then what access we have to lethal means that we could use if we get in a bad place.
I'm not going to lie. I definitely, when you started talking about suicide, I definitely had a couple of twinges of anxiety
Yeah.
because that's something I struggled with in my transition. I struggled with, whether that was a viable option or not. There were days where I was so anxious and so depressed and so emotionally distraught that, that thought crossed my mind on more than one occasion, and I think that it's just important to recognize that and to, be on the lookout for not only, the emotions that are going through internally, but also for, the people that are closest to you to be able to recognize, some of the more obvious signs that, your loved one is not okay. What are some of the warning signs that people can be on the lookout for that would tell them, hey, something's not right, I need to ask them about it, or something else?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, if you know someone well and you notice a change, speak up, because it sometimes starts off with little subtle changes in mood, in, level of interest in interacting. We start to see folks isolating a bit whenever they become overwhelmed or maybe having thoughts of suicide, because it is something that often people want to keep more private. So we might see someone that used to want to spend time with others. And that can be in our own families where there's just a little bit more of a withdrawn posture or isolation at work, or work performance decreases. What is interesting that we see with some high achievers, though, is that sometimes work performance is the only thing that doesn't get affected because everything else is falling apart. And so even a change in productivity that seems uncharacteristic for someone could be a sign that they are over functioning and over committing. And I know that is my story. So I am someone that when I am struggling, no one would ever know at work because I will throw everything into work, not to deal with things that are going on personally. I am the queen of compartmentalization, even though I know better, but I know that I will work more and work harder. And then when the, the wall comes crumbling down, often what I would hear is, I had no idea. You never said anything. I never would have been able to tell. And I realized that that isn't great. Like I needed to be able to let that go. So I mention all of that because you can see it on both sides of the spectrum. Someone may withdraw, or they may be, exceptionally more social than before because they're maybe going out to bars and drinking and doing things that are uncharacteristic for who they are. Or they may be underworking or overworking, or there's just changes in how they're reacting to things. They have a short fuse. They seem very impatient and irritable. Sleep issues, like maybe somebody's been mostly sleeping okay. And I think a lot of times with people that work shift work, we want to blame the shift and not blame the symptoms. We want to say, well, I'm not sleeping because I'm on nights. And that may or may not be a contributor. Of course, it could be, but there may also be other things going on. So even if your spouse starts to say, like, hey, you've been waking up a lot more, you've been having nightmares, you've been moving a lot while you're sleeping, that can be a sign that something is kind of stirring internally that you may not even be aware of because you are sleeping. So really noticing those changes in yourself, what other people are sharing for you, and knowing who you are and how you handle stress and how you cope can give you that insight into, okay, things are not feeling okay for me because I am not myself. I don't feel like myself. And I'm starting to do things that are uncharacteristic for who I am.
Well, to say that I wasn't going on a trip down memory lane when you were talking about that would be inaccurate. I think, it's, even though we're talking about in general, what people would do, like it's still very much impacts my life as well. Obviously it impacts yours.
Yeah.
And, I think it's just really important for us to call out, the elephant in the room. And I think departments and agencies are getting better at doing that and making it more okay. When I worked for the Houston Police Department, we had an in-house psychologist. And the only people who ever went to her were because they were forced to, for a critical incident or something like that. Because, there was the fear that if they made an outcry or they did something like that, that it would get back to the department.
Right.
And, based upon the, some of the stories and some of the things that were happening back then, that was a valid fear to have.
Right.
Now, whether it was actually based in reality for HPD, I have no idea. But, there's this culture that pervades law enforcement and multiple other, organizations like the military, where, we don't ask for help because it's seen as, well, you can't handle it anymore. We need to take you out of your current position. We need to assign you to the desk, or we need to assign you to this. When in reality, law enforcement agencies and even the military right now are experiencing significant issues with hiring, significant issues with retention, and, it's every day I see like PDs in the military saying, hey, we'll pay you $15,000 to come work with us. We'll pay you this, we'll pay you that. And I'm not saying obviously this is the panacea by any means, but if agencies and organizations realize that mental health was such a ever-present factor in the lives of their employees, and they offered, really significant resources, I bet, and this is just me, but I bet that retention would go up. I bet that people would not be retiring or be moving to a different department or leaving, quite so early in their careers if mental health was given the priority that it deserves. Because, at least in my day, it wasn't, it was very much it was a weakness. Right. And, I know there's an organization out there called Performance Protocol. Like, I know we talked about this already, that, is trying to bridge that gap and increase retention of agencies across the country by providing coaching by current and former law enforcement professionals. And I think that if that idea takes off, then it could really be something significant for law enforcement across the U.S. But ultimately, it's incumbent upon departments to put the resources in place for individuals to feel like, yes, I can reach out. No, it's not going to be held against me, and everything that I say to them is going to be held in the highest confidentiality, as according to local, state, and federal statutes.
Right.
And so what I had a really good thought, and it was going somewhere, and then I just lost it. So what type of services do you offer in your business right now?
Sure. Well, I did want to piggyback on what you just said, because I cannot remember who shared it with me, but someone mentioned that they find it interesting that law enforcement keeps up with, like, twice a year quals, and make sure that they know how to use their gun when they may never really have to shoot their gun, but they might get mention of mental health once or twice in their career, even though that's a struggle every day. And I just thought that was a really interesting analogy to say, we focus so much on the job training, which of course could at any point be important, but if we don't also include that mental health component, are we missing the boat? Because that is something that inevitably is going to be a big pull. So to that end, my group practice right now, we have just 2 clinicians, but we will be at 4 at the end of next month. And I specialize in first responder mental health. As I mentioned, I do some wellness check-ins for one local police department right now, and I'll be adding another in the fall. And those are mandated by the state of Missouri to happen at a certain interval, whether it's yearly or every other year, for sworn law enforcement. And some agencies are giving the option to civilians, which I love, because that includes folks like dispatchers and other people that might have some exposure to things that might be experiencing some symptoms as well. So that's another service that I provide, is those wellness check-ins. And what's been really great about those is it gives access to a culturally competent clinician. And if someone does decide to continue services and seek therapy, then they don't have to do the legwork to find someone that will understand. And there are several other clinicians in the Kansas City metro area that have those same relationships with other departments. And so we too are trying to bridge that gap. Similarly, one of the therapy modalities that I offer that's really popular for folks who have experienced cumulative trauma is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It is a trauma therapy that involves less talking than talk therapy, which is attractive to people that don't want to get into, every detail about everything they've experienced. But what it does is helps build new neural networks to help our brain view things in a different way. So instead of feeling that hypervigilance or that constant feeling of I am powerless, or I am helpless, or some other negative belief, we can help the brain look at things differently because we teach it different skills, because the brain is teachable. So that's another really popular treatment that I offer here at my practice. And then I do some training and some teaching, and I just kind of have my hands in a lot of different things so I don't get bored. So
I love that. I actually, at the urging of my wife, I actually just tried EMDR a couple of months ago, and it was interesting. I did a lot of research about it before I tried it, and obviously, as with anything, the results are hugely subjective. It's been absolutely amazing for her, and I think for me, there's a certain, even with all of the counseling that I've done over the years, there's a certain level of like, is this legit?
It sounds
so I think
crazy.
Yeah, it does, but I can't argue with the results. And I think it's going to take me some time to, I guess, fully understand the effects and to really kind of wade in, feet first. But I'm encouraged by by what has transpired already.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you're exactly right. You've got to be patient with the process. You're dealing with a lot of years of stuff, so it's not going to be fixed overnight, but you're doing the work and your brain is doing the work. And that's what I tell my clients and patients is, your brain is still working outside of session and we're just teaching it a new way to think about things. And if you've tried everything else and it hasn't worked, what's the harm in trying something else in case it does? And so because sometimes when people come, they're like, I've been in counseling for 20 years and nothing's helped me. But if you haven't done this, let's try it. Or even if you did do it, but you're in a different place in life, there's not risk associated with trying something new to see if it's the right fit for you. And so I've been really encouraged. Like you, I was skeptical of it. I'd heard a lot about it, but it does sound, somebody called it voodoo witchcraft whenever I was trying to tell them about it. And I do know that it sounds very bizarre, but when you learn about it and how it works, it makes sense. And when you see the results, I'm always, laughing with people at the end because they're like, what did you just do? Like, how did that work? And it's been really neat to see people that have struggled for a really long time and feel like they've exhausted everything and be able to do it, in a different way. And, EMDR, because it's so popular, there's all kinds of things. There's retreats where you can do intensive EMDR for 5 days with, WCPR, which is the West Coast Trauma Prevention. And so there are all kinds of things that if you feel like you've tried this, you've tried that, just don't give up because there really are, you can find what works for you. And then you'll be so relieved when you did.
awesome. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being with us today. And if people wanted to reach out to you and to chat or to have a consultation, how would they do that?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, Rachel N. Murdock, and I also have a business page on Instagram, which is Beyond the Storm KC, and my work email is rachel@beyondthestormkc.com, website www.beyondthestormkc.com.
Is there anything else that we're missing?
No, that is all the .com, so we're good.
Awesome. Well, again, I really appreciate you being with us and volunteering your time. Is there any other advice or anything else that you want to pass along?
I would just say that, if your transition is voluntary or not, you are going to be okay. And having the courage to get yourself back out there, whether that's, private sector or self-employment or whatever that looks like for you, there really is happiness on the other side. And just give yourself the grace and space to go through the transition and have hope for the future.
That's words to live by right there. Well, hey, thank you so much and really, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, of course.